Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian. Take a moment, before we begin, to settle yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find a posture that feels comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Soften your jaw. Let the day go. Tonight we are going to travel slowly through one of the longest, strangest, most patient stories in all of human history. The story of an empire that should not have survived, and did again and again for 1,000 years longer than anyone reasonably expected. The story of a city by a narrow strait that called itself Roman until the very last hour. The story of Byzantium. If you have listened, in some other quiet evening, to the long collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, to the sack of Rome, to the deposition of the last Western emperor, to the slow forgetting of Latin civilization, then you know already that the story did not in fact end there. The western half died. The eastern half kept going. Tonight we are going to follow the eastern half, through 977 more years, through plague, and conquest, and brilliant emperors, and ruinous ones, through the loss of 2/3 of the empire, and its slow regathering, through schism with the Latin West, through siege after siege of a single city that, again and again, refused to fall, until, on a Tuesday morning in May, in the year 1453, it finally did. There is no urgency to any of this. The Byzantines, like the Romans before them, were not in a hurry. They lived in slow centuries. They made decisions over lifetimes. The empire that survived was, in some real sense, the empire that knew how to wait. So you also do not need to hurry. You can let the names drift past. You can let the dates blur. You can fall asleep at any moment. The story will keep going, just as the empire did, with or without anyone watching. It is the 27th of December in the year 537. The city is Constantinople, the new Rome, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that joins the Aegean and the Black Sea. The day is cold. There has been snow on the great walls in the morning. The sky over the city is the color of old pewter. Inside the imperial palace complex, on the long peninsula that juts out into the Sea of Marmara, the emperor is preparing to walk a short distance, on foot, to a building that has just been finished. The emperor is named Justinian. He is about 55 years old. He has been on the throne for 10 years. He is, by every account that survives, a deeply pious man, a careful administrator, a stubborn negotiator, a slightly twitchy public speaker, and the ruler of an empire that, at this particular moment, stretches from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the headwaters of the Euphrates. He has been, lately, very busy. The building he is walking toward is a church. It is the third church to be built on this particular spot in the heart of the city. The first burned down in a riot in the 4th century. The second burned down in a riot 5 years earlier. This one Justinian intends will not burn. It is built on a scale that no one in the Roman world has ever quite attempted before. Its central dome is 180 feet across, and rises 180 feet above the floor. From a distance, on the approach by water, it looks as though the dome is floating, suspended on light, with no solid roof beneath it. The architects who designed it have used a new kind of structural mathematics, never tried at this scale, and they are not entirely confident, even on this morning, that the dome will hold. It will hold. It will be repaired several times over the next 1500 years, but it will hold. It is still standing tonight, in modern Istanbul, exactly where Justinian walked into it on that cold December morning. We call it the Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom. There is a story, possibly true, possibly invented, that when Justinian crossed the threshold for the first time, he looked up into the dome and said, very quietly, "Solomon, I have outdone you." He had built, he believed, a church that the Hebrew kings of the Old Testament could not have imagined. It was, and in some ways still is, the most beautiful building the late ancient world ever produced. It is the building, more than any other, that people mean when they say Byzantine. Tonight, our story begins here, in this cold December morning, with this calm emperor crossing the threshold of his great church. But it is also a story that, in its essential shape, ends here, because the Hagia Sophia, in its long life, will outlast every emperor who walks through its doors after Justinian. It will outlast the Roman government that built it. It will, in the end, become a mosque. And in its long, slow continuity, its same dome, its same mosaics, its same cool air, it will be one of the few things that links the world of Justinian to the world 1,000 years later, when the last Byzantine emperor will hear the final liturgy here on the night before the city falls. That is what tonight's story is about. The slow, patient, almost incomprehensible continuity of an empire that should have died many times over and instead refused. Let us walk forward into it. Justinian himself we have, in some other evening story, already left dying in his palace, in the late autumn of the year 565, 83 years old, alone in the imperial bedroom, with the Empress Theodora dead 17 years before him. He had reigned for 38 years. He had codified Roman law. He had built the Hagia Sophia. He had reconquered from the barbarian kingdoms of the West, North Africa and Italy, and a corner of southern Spain. He had buried, somewhere in those campaigns, perhaps 2/3 of his treasury, and an entire generation of his soldiers. He had presided over the most catastrophic plague the late ancient world had yet seen, the plague of Justinian, the same disease that would, 800 years later, return as the Black Death, which had killed in his reign somewhere between 20 and 40 million people across the Mediterranean. He left behind in his nephew Justin II, a successor who was unprepared, ill, and almost immediately overwhelmed. The story of Byzantium, after Justinian, is for some long stretch the story of the empire learning, slowly and at enormous cost, what it could not afford to do. Justinian had reached for the entire old Roman world. His successors discovered, century by century, that the Eastern Empire could not, in fact, hold the entire old Roman world. North Africa would last another century before the Arabs took it. Italy would slip, piece by piece, into the hands of the Lombards and then the Franks, and then, eventually, the popes themselves. Spain would be lost almost immediately. The reach of Justinian, in retrospect, would come to look like the highest tide of a flood that had been receding, slowly, for hundreds of years already. But this slow contraction did not, in the moment, feel like decline to the people who lived through it. It felt like adjustment. It felt like a long, careful learning. The empire that Justin II inherited was still enormous by any modern measure. It still controlled most of the eastern Mediterranean coast, all of Anatolia, most of the Balkans, the entire Aegean. The great cities of Antioch and Alexandria and Carthage and Constantinople. It still spoke Latin in its laws and Greek in its schools. It still considered itself, without irony, to be the Roman Empire, simply continuing. Justin II was a tragic figure. He came to the throne competent, energetic, well-meaning. Within a few years he had collapsed under the weight of imperial decisions, lost his mind in slow, unmistakable stages, and had to be physically restrained from harming himself or the courtiers around him. The chronicles describe him in his last years being wheeled through the palace in a small chair, biting the heads of attendants when they came too close, screaming at imagined demons in the corridors. His wife, the Empress Sophia, ran the empire in his name. When he died, in 578, almost no one in the city was sad. The next several emperors are a kind of blur. Tiberius II, calm and dignified, ruled for 4 years and died of natural causes, which by this point in our story is itself a noteworthy achievement. Maurice, his successor, ruled for 20 years, fought hard wars on every frontier, and in the end was murdered, with all of his sons, by a mutinous officer named Phocas, who declared himself emperor. The reign of Phocas, which lasted 8 years, was a near-total disaster. He was a violent man, he was a paranoid man. He killed almost everyone of competence in the imperial court, on the suspicion that they might one day kill him. He let the frontiers go to ruin. The Sasanian Persians, sensing weakness, invaded the east in force. The Avars, north of the Danube, swept across the Balkans almost unopposed. By the year 610, the empire was bleeding out from every side, and the population of Constantinople, which is to say, the population that mattered, had had enough. A young general named Heraclius, the son of the Roman governor of Carthage, sailed up the African coast and across the Mediterranean with a small fleet of his father's troops, entered Constantinople through the Sea of Marmara, found Phocas in the imperial palace, and, after a brief and very strange conversation about why Phocas had ruled so badly, Phocas reportedly answered, "Will you, who come to take my place, rule any better?" Had him beheaded on the docks. Heraclius is not a name most people know tonight, but in the long story of Byzantium, he is, perhaps, the most important emperor. Because the empire he inherited, in 610, was on the verge of total annihilation, and by the time he died, in 641, the structural shape of the empire that would survive for the next 800 years had been laid down by his hands. Heraclius was, when he took the throne, 35 years old, a soldier, a competent administrator, a deeply religious man. He took the throne in a city that was already partly besieged. The Persians, by that year, had taken Antioch. By 614 they had taken Jerusalem itself, and had carried away, in triumph, the relic that Christians believed to be the true cross. By 619 they had taken Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, the source of grain for Constantinople. By 626 they had reached the Bosphorus, and an enormous combined Persian and Avar army was camped on both sides of the city, preparing to take Constantinople itself. Heraclius in those years did something almost no one expected. While the great enemy armies sat outside his capital, he gathered what was left of his field army, took ship across the Black Sea, sailed up into the Caucasus, and attacked the Persian Empire from behind. It was the kind of operation that, on paper, makes no sense. He left his capital undefended. He marched into the heart of his enemy's territory with a small, exhausted army. It worked. The Persian king, Khosrow II, had to recall his armies from the Mediterranean to defend his own homeland. Heraclius pushed through Armenia and into Mesopotamia. He defeated the main Persian field army at a place called Nineveh, on the Tigris, in December of 627. Khosrow II was overthrown by his own son and executed. The new Persian king sued for peace. Egypt was returned. Syria was returned. Palestine was returned. The true cross was carried, by Heraclius himself, on foot, through the streets of Jerusalem, back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is probably the greatest single comeback in the history of Byzantium. It is also, in retrospect, almost completely meaningless. Because while Heraclius and the Persians had been exhausting each other in 25 years of war, something had been quietly happening, on the margins of both empires, in the sandy southern peninsula, that had until then mattered to neither of them. A new religion was being born, and the people who carried it would, within 10 years of Heraclius's triumph, take everything he had recovered, and almost everything else as well. In the year 632, a man named Muhammad died in a small town in western Arabia called Medina. He was about 62 years old. He had been, for the last decade of his life, the political and religious leader of an emerging community of monotheist believers who called themselves Muslims, the Submitters. He had taught, in increasingly systematic form, a strict, austere, deeply principled faith centered on the worship of one God, the rejection of idols, the obligations of charity and prayer, and the conviction that he himself was the last and most authoritative of a long line of prophets that included Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. When he died, his community numbered perhaps a few tens of thousands of people, mostly concentrated in the towns of Mecca and Medina. The Roman and Persian empires, who knew vaguely of his existence, did not regard him as a serious matter. They were both exhausted from 25 years of fighting one another. They had, in the spring of 632, no spare attention for the religious developments of an obscure Arabian town. Within 100 years of Muhammad's death, Muslim armies would conquer Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, North Africa, Persia, and Spain. They would reach, in the west, the Pyrenees. They would reach, in the east, the Indus River. They would build an empire larger than Rome's at its height, larger than Persia's at its height, larger than any empire the world had previously seen. And on the way, they would take from Heraclius and his successors almost everything Heraclius had spent his life recovering. The first serious raid into Roman territory came in 634, only 2 years after Muhammad's death. A Roman field army was defeated at a place called Ajnadain, in southern Palestine. The Roman survivors fell back to Damascus. Damascus fell in 635. A larger Roman army, under Heraclius's brother Theodore, was sent south to retake the situation. It was destroyed, almost completely, in 636, at a place called the Yarmouk, on a tributary of the Jordan. The Yarmouk is one of the decisive battles of human history, although almost no one outside the academic study of Byzantine warfare has heard of it. After the Yarmouk, there was no significant Roman field army left in the eastern provinces. Jerusalem fell in 637, after a brief siege. The patriarch of the city, an old monk named Sophronius, opened the gates personally to the second caliph, Umar, on the strict condition that the city's Christians would not be massacred. They were not. Umar entered the city on foot, in patched and dusty clothes, and asked to be shown the holy sites. He prayed at the steps of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but refused to pray inside, on the grounds that future Muslims might use his prayer there as an excuse to convert the church into a mosque. It was, by every account that survives, an oddly civilized conquest. Egypt fell over the next 4 years. Alexandria, the second city of the Eastern Empire, the seat of one of the great patriarchates, the home of the great library and the great schools, was taken in 642, 4 months after Heraclius's death. The grain ships of Egypt, which had fed Constantinople for almost 700 years, would now feed a different capital. The Roman world had lost half of itself in less than a decade. Heraclius died of edema, in his palace, in February of 641. He was 66 years old. He had ruled for 31 years. He had, in the first half of his reign, performed the most miraculous recovery any Roman emperor had ever performed. He had, in the second half of his reign, watched almost the entire fruit of that recovery torn away by an enemy he had never anticipated, and could not, at the end, even reach. The empire that was left, by his death, was a much smaller thing. Anatolia, the Balkans, south of the Danube, a few outposts in southern Italy and Sicily, and the city itself. Perhaps a third of what Justinian had ruled, perhaps a fifth of what the empire had been at its height under Trajan. The wealth was gone, the population was gone, the grain was gone. The historic heartland, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, all gone. What remained was a Greek-speaking, Christian, fortified, embattled rump. And yet, as we have learned in these long evenings before, empires die slowly. The Roman story, even after the catastrophe of the 7th century, was not over. It still had 800 years left to it. The shape of those 800 years was decided in many ways in the desperate decades after Heraclius. The empire reorganized itself. It abandoned the great open fields of late antique military strategy and fell back, instead, on a system of small, fortified, locally raised armies based on the natural strongholds of Anatolia. It abandoned Latin in its imperial administration, and operated, from this point on, almost entirely in Greek. It abandoned the universalist pretensions of Justinian, and accepted, slowly and reluctantly, that it was now one state among many, even if it still called itself the Roman Empire. It became, in other words, what we now call Byzantine. The historians who later named this period invented the word Byzantine to capture exactly this transformation. The moment when the late Roman world, under the catastrophic pressure of the 7th century, finally became something different from what it had been. The Byzantines themselves never used the word. They called themselves, until the very end, simply Romaioi, Romans. Of all the things that survived the 7th century catastrophe, the most important, in many ways, was a wall. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople had been built 200 years earlier, in the early 5th century, under the Emperor Theodosius II. They ran for about 4 miles across the European peninsula on which the city sat, from the Sea of Marmara on the south to the Golden Horn on the north. They were not, by the standards of late antique fortification, particularly elegant. They were not built for show. They were built to hold an enemy out of a city that, after the 5th century, would never again have a field army capable of meeting one in open battle. What they were, by every measure that mattered, was thick. The outer line was a low forewall, perhaps 30 feet high, separated from the deep moat by a narrow walking platform. Behind the forewall ran a wider, higher line, perhaps 40 feet high, set back about 20 feet, with towers every 50 meters. Behind that, set back another 40 feet, ran the main wall, a vast inner curtain, 60 feet high, 20 feet thick at the base, with towers spaced every 50 meters and rising another 40 feet above the wall itself. 3 lines of stone, with 2 killing zones between them, and a moat in front of all 3. There was nothing else like it in the late ancient world. There was, for 1,000 years, almost nothing else like it anywhere. The Theodosian walls would be tested, again and again, by every great power that arose in the Middle East and the Balkans. The Avars and Persians, in 626, while Heraclius was off in Armenia. The Arabs, in 2 long sieges, in 674, and again in 717. The Bulgars, several times. The Rus, in their longboats. The Crusaders, in 1204. The Ottomans, repeatedly, until the final time. For more than 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls held. Constantinople, behind them, became, in the imagination of the medieval world, the unconquerable city. The capital that could not be taken. It is, of course, eventually taken. We will get there. But the long story of Byzantium is, in many ways, the story of the Theodosian walls. Without them, Constantinople would have fallen in any of a dozen sieges across 9 centuries, and the empire would have ended each time. With them, the city held and the empire held, even when almost everything else had been lost. The first great Arab siege began in 674. It lasted, off and on, for 4 years. The Arab fleet anchored in the Sea of Marmara every summer, and withdrew every winter. The Arab army camped on the western approaches and pressed against the walls. The defenders behind the walls held. The defenders also had a new weapon, a recent invention attributed to a Greek refugee from Syria named Kallinikos. The weapon was a kind of inflammable liquid. Its exact composition is, even today, not certainly known, though most modern scholars think it included naphtha, possibly with quicklime, possibly with sulfur, that could be sprayed under pressure from copper siphons mounted on the prows of fast Roman ships. The liquid burned even on water. It stuck to whatever it touched. It could not be extinguished, in many cases, except by smothering with sand or vinegar. It was called, then and forever afterward, Greek fire. It is one of the few genuinely revolutionary weapons of the medieval world, and one of the very few whose secret a civilization successfully kept for centuries. The Byzantines used it against the Arabs in 674. They used it again against the Second Arab Siege of 717, when an even larger Arab fleet was systematically destroyed at sea, while their land army starved before the walls. They used it against the Rus, against the Bulgars, against everyone who attacked the city. The exact recipe was guarded by oath, kept in the imperial palace, passed down through a small hereditary brotherhood of imperial engineers, and eventually, sometime in the late medieval period, simply forgotten. We do not know the exact recipe today. The Second Arab Siege of 717 and 718 was perhaps the most important defensive moment in Byzantine history. The empire that survived that siege was the empire that survived. The Caliphate, after that siege, never again seriously attempted to take Constantinople. It turned its attention west, to North Africa, to Spain. The eastern frontier between Byzantine and Arab territory settled, slowly, into a stable line through Anatolia. The catastrophic 7th century gave way, by the early 8th, to a difficult but stable equilibrium. The empire was still there, the walls were still there. The city was still there. The next great convulsion of Byzantine history was not, for once, a war. It was an argument. A long, slow, often violent, almost incomprehensibly bitter argument about whether it was acceptable for Christians to make pictures of God. The argument is now called the Iconoclastic Controversy, from the Greek words for image breaker. It began, more or less, in 726, when the Emperor Leo III, the same emperor who had defended the city in the Second Arab Siege, ordered the removal of an icon of Christ from above the great bronze gate of the imperial palace. It ended, more or less, in 843, when the Empress Theodora, regent for her young son Michael III, formally restored the veneration of icons at a council in Constantinople. In between, for 117 years, the empire tore at itself over a question that to modern ears can sound almost trivial. It was not trivial. The argument was, at root, a dispute about whether the divine could be represented in physical matter. whether a painted board or a mosaic on a wall, could legitimately depict God or the saints, and whether those depictions could legitimately be venerated by the faithful. The iconoclasts said no. They pointed to the second commandment, the explicit prohibition in the Hebrew scriptures against making graven images. They pointed to the fact that the Muslims, who had just conquered half of the empire, made no such images. They argued that icons were idolatry, that they confused the worshipper, that they limited the unrepresentable God to mere pigment on wood. The iconodules, the icon venerators, said yes. They argued that the incarnation itself, the doctrine that God had become a particular human being in a particular time and place, made depiction not only possible but required. To say that God could not be depicted, they argued, was to say that he had not really become human. The image, properly used, was not idolatry. It was a window through which the worshipper could pass, with the image leading toward the prototype, never resting on the image itself. This is the kind of argument that, framed in summary form, sounds like an academic dispute. In practice, it tore the empire apart. Emperors deposed and persecuted iconodule monks, sometimes by the thousands. Iconoclast mobs smashed icons across Anatolia and the Balkans. Iconodule exiles fled to Italy, where they helped to harden the developing breach between the Greek East and the Latin West. The Pope of Rome, who in the early 8th century was still nominally a Roman imperial subject, broke with the iconoclast emperors and sought protection elsewhere, eventually, in the rising power of the Frankish kings. It is one of the long, slow streams that, over many centuries, carried Greek and Latin Christianity away from each other. The argument also produced, perhaps as compensation for what had been destroyed, the great flowering of Byzantine religious art. After the final restoration of icons in 843, the Byzantines spent the next several centuries refining a tradition of icon painting and church mosaic that has, in its quiet way, almost no peer in human visual history. The great mosaic Christ of the Hagia Sophia, the mosaic apse of the Church of the Mother of God in Nicaea, the painted icons that even tonight you can see in 1,000 Greek and Russian and Bulgarian churches around the world. All of this, in some sense, is the flower that grew up out of the long quarrel. In the year 867, the Emperor of Constantinople was a young, intelligent, well-educated man named Michael III, who had been on the throne since he was a small child. He was 27 years old. He had a complicated personal life, a serious drinking problem, and very few competent advisors. One of his closest companions, a former groom from a poor Armenian family in Macedonia, who had risen at court by physical strength and force of personality, was a man named Basil. On the night of the 23rd of September of that year, while Michael lay in a drunken sleep in his quarters, Basil, and a small group of conspirators, entered the room and killed him. Basil declared himself emperor the next morning. He took the throne under the name Basil I. He founded what historians now call the Macedonian dynasty. It would last for the next 200 years, and those 200 years would constitute the closest thing the Byzantine Empire ever had to a golden age. It is in many ways an unjust naming. The dynasty, although founded by a peasant from Macedonia, had relatively little to do with Macedonia as a region. It was based, like every Byzantine dynasty, in Constantinople. It ruled, like every Byzantine dynasty, an empire that was Greek-speaking and Anatolian Balkan Aegean in shape. But the name has stuck, and so we use it. Under the Macedonian emperors, Basil I, Leo VI the Wise, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, Romanos II, Nikephoros II Phorcus, John I Tzimisces, Basil II the Bulgar Slayer, Constantine VIII, Romanos III Argyros, Michael IV, the Paphlagonian, and onward through the 11th century, the empire expanded, almost continuously, for the first time in nearly 400 years. It pushed back the Arabs, it retook Crete and Cyprus, it pushed into northern Syria, recovering Antioch in 969. It defeated, at enormous cost, the long-standing Bulgarian threat in the Balkans, in a series of campaigns culminating in the bloody victory of Basil II at Kleidion in 1014, after which the emperor blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners and sent them home in groups of 100, each group led by a one-eyed man, to demonstrate to the Bulgarian king what awaited any future opposition. Basil II's reign, lasting from 976 to 1025, is the high tide of medieval Byzantine power. The empire he passed on, at his death, was larger and stronger than it had been at any time since Heraclius. It controlled most of Anatolia, all of the Balkans, the entire Aegean, southern Italy, much of Syria. It had the most disciplined and feared army in the Christian world. It had a treasury filled to overflowing. It had pushed its boundaries back, in places, almost to where they had been under Justinian. Basil II himself was a strange figure. He never married, he had no children. He lived, by every account, like a soldier, sleeping in plain quarters, eating plain food, dressing in plain woolen clothes, dying as he had lived, an enormously powerful man with no particular interest in personal pleasure. He had, his contemporaries said, the eyes of a wolf. When he died, the empire passed, by default, to his unmarried elderly brother, Constantine VIII, an amiable and lazy man who reigned for 3 years, did almost nothing of consequence, and died, leaving the throne to his 3 daughters. The competent statecraft of the Macedonian dynasty, which had been built by a peasant murderer in 867, slowly came apart over the next 40 years in the hands of his less talented descendants. By the second half of the 11th century, the empire was vulnerable again, and a new threat was beginning to gather, in the steppe lands beyond the Caspian Sea, that no Byzantine emperor had yet quite anticipated. The Seljuk Turks were a clan of Turkic-speaking pastoralists from the Central Asian steppe. They had converted to Islam in the late 10th century. They had moved, slowly, westward through the 11th century, taking control of large portions of the Eastern Islamic world, defeating the older Arab dynasties, and arriving by the middle of the century on the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire. For about 20 years, the relationship between the Seljuks and the Byzantines was a slow series of border skirmishes, raids, and uneasy treaties. Then, in 1071, a new and ambitious emperor in Constantinople named Romanos IV Diogenes decided to settle the matter once and for all. He gathered the field army of the empire, perhaps 40,000 men, the largest force the Byzantines had assembled in many years, and marched east into Armenia. He met the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, on a wide plain, near a small fortress called Manzikert, on the 26th of August of that year. The battle was a complete disaster. The 2 armies engaged, broke, regrouped, engaged again. Late in the day, a Byzantine cavalry corps, under the command of one Andronikos Doukas, a political rival of Romanos, from a powerful Constantinopolitan family, abandoned the field, deliberately, to ensure the emperor's defeat. The Byzantine center was overrun. Romanos himself was captured. He was treated, in his captivity, with surprising generosity. Alp Arslan asked him, before letting him go, "What would you do if I were brought to you as a prisoner?" Romanos answered honestly, "I would have you killed or paraded through the streets of Constantinople in chains." Alp Arslan, by some accounts, replied, "My punishment is far heavier. I forgive you and set you free." Romanos was released, ransomed, and sent back to Constantinople, where he was deposed, blinded with red-hot irons, and exiled to a monastery on a small Aegean island, where he died of his wounds within a few weeks. The Seljuks, in the years immediately after Manzikert, did not press their advantage. They were busy elsewhere. But the political collapse of the Byzantine field army, combined with the civil war that broke out in Constantinople over the succession, opened all of Anatolia to slow, casual settlement. By the end of the 11th century, almost the entire interior of Anatolia, the heartland of the empire for 700 years, the source of its soldiers, its grain, its taxes, was under Turkish control. The empire had been, in a single afternoon, cut off from its body. It survived, but as a coastal rim around an Anatolian core that no longer belonged to it. Manzikert, in retrospect, is the moment when the long Byzantine recovery turns, finally, into the long Byzantine decline. The empire would, for the next 400 years, never again be strong enough to threaten its neighbors, only strong enough to survive them. In 1095, almost 25 years after Manzikert, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent a letter west, across the religious gap that had been growing between Greek and Latin Christianity for centuries. He wrote to the Pope of Rome, Urban II. He explained that the Christian East was in trouble. The Turks had taken Anatolia. Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for over 400 years. The Christian shrines of the Holy Land were administered by people who, in the Latin imagination, were the enemies of the faith. If the Pope could send some Latin knights, a few thousand experienced cavalry perhaps, to supplement the reduced Byzantine armies, they would be most welcome. The Pope, who had his own reasons to want a great Christian undertaking, responded. He preached in November of 1095, at the Council of Clermont in southern France, a sermon that has gone down in history as one of the most consequential religious sermons ever delivered. He called upon the Latin Knights of Western Europe to march east, to free Jerusalem from the Muslims, to assist their Christian brethren in the East, and to win, in the process, the remission of their sins. The response was immense. By the spring of 1096, an enormous army of Latin Christians, perhaps 100,000 strong, was beginning to gather and move east. This was not exactly what Alexios had asked for. He had asked for a few thousand mercenary knights. He had received an entire migrating Latin army, with kings and dukes and bishops, and tens of thousands of camp followers, demanding food, transportation, and an unclear share of any conquered territory. He had to feed them. He had to ferry them across the Bosphorus. He had to negotiate at every step, with men he did not trust, who barely spoke his language, who treated him with a suspicion bordering on contempt. The Crusaders, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded. They took Antioch in 1098. They took Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, in a sack so brutal, Christians, Muslims, and Jews killed indiscriminately, the streets of the city, by every account, running with blood, that it would haunt the historical memory of the Eastern Mediterranean for many centuries. They established in the Levantine coast a series of small Crusader kingdoms: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, that would, in various forms, last for nearly 2 centuries. The Byzantines, taking advantage of the Crusader pressure, recovered some of their Anatolian territory. The relationship between them and the Crusaders, however, only got worse over the next century. They were, in religious terms, both Christian. They were also, in every other respect, 2 different worlds. The Byzantines spoke Greek, the Crusaders spoke Latin. The Byzantines worshipped in long, repetitive, candlelit liturgies, in cool stone churches. The Crusaders worshipped in clattering Latin masses, in dark Romanesque chapels. The Byzantines were urban, taxed, bureaucratic. The Crusaders were rural, feudal, Military. They differed on bread. The Byzantines used leavened bread for the Eucharist. The Latins used unleavened. They differed on the Filioque, the Latin addition to the Nicene Creed, not accepted by the Greeks. They differed on the authority of the Pope, on clerical celibacy, on the date of Easter. They differed, most fundamentally, on whether each side took the other's religion entirely seriously. By the late 12th century, the relationship was poisonous on both sides. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as crude, violent, faintly heretical Latins, who had come east to plunder, and would, if allowed, turn the Christian East into a colony. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as effeminate, untrustworthy, scheming Greeks, who promised cooperation and delivered betrayal. Both views had elements of truth in them. Both views also had elements of caricature. It is in this climate of mistrust, by the early 13th century, that the Fourth Crusade was launched. It was meant, in theory, to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to Saladin a few years earlier. What it actually did, in 1204, was sack Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade is one of the most extraordinary disasters in the history of Christian civilization. A Crusader army, gathered to fight Muslims in Egypt, instead spent its full force destroying the largest Christian city in the world, the city it had nominally come to assist. How this happened is a long story, and most of the men who made it happen did not, individually, intend it. But they made it happen anyway. The crusade had been organized in 1201. The plan was to attack Egypt, the heart of the Ayyubid Sultanate, that controlled Jerusalem by sea. The Crusader leadership had contracted with the Republic of Venice, the great maritime trading state of the northern Adriatic, for the transport. Venice had built, at enormous expense, a fleet capable of carrying tens of thousands of men, horses and equipment across the Mediterranean. When the Crusaders arrived at Venice in 1202, however, they were significantly fewer than expected, and they could not pay the contracted price. The Venetians, who had now built and assembled a fleet they could not be paid for, proposed a deal. They would extend credit to the Crusaders on the condition that the army first attack the city of Zara, a Christian port on the Dalmatian coast that had recently revolted from Venetian control, to compensate Venice for the trouble. The Crusaders agreed. They sacked Zara, a Catholic city, in November of 1202, despite an explicit and furious papal excommunication threatening every man involved. The crusade was already, before it had reached the Holy Land, off the rails. The next complication was a Byzantine prince. Alexios Angelos, a young claimant to the Byzantine throne, whose father had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup, had fled west and was looking for help. He approached the Crusaders in 1203 with an offer. If they would help him take Constantinople, restore his father and place him on the throne, he would in return pay the entire Crusader debt to Venice, provide them with thousands of additional troops and supplies for their Egyptian expedition, and place the Byzantine Church under the authority of the Pope of Rome. The Crusader leadership, hesitant but tempted, accepted. The fleet sailed for Constantinople in the summer of 1203. They forced the city, briefly, in July, and installed Alexios Angelos as co-emperor with his blinded father. Then, almost immediately, the arrangement collapsed. The new emperor could not pay what he had promised. The Constantinopolitans hated him. He was deposed, in a popular uprising, in early 1204. The Crusaders, now stranded outside the city, denied their promised payment, and increasingly resentful of the Byzantines, decided to take the city for themselves. The second siege began in early April of 1204. On the 12th, the Crusaders and Venetians forced the sea walls of the city, the same walls that had held off Arabs and Avars and Bulgars for 7 centuries, by ramming siege ships against the towers and bridging across with planks. The defenders, who had no real field army, broke. The Crusaders entered the city. What followed for 3 days is one of the worst urban catastrophes in medieval European history. The Crusaders, given license to plunder, plundered. They broke into the Hagia Sophia. They smashed the altar. They drank from the chalices. They stripped the gilt from the walls and the bronze from the doors. They installed a prostitute on the patriarchal throne, where she sang bawdy songs while the soldiers toasted her. They broke open the imperial tombs, including the tomb of Justinian, and stripped the bodies. They carried away, and this is the part that in many ways hurt the most, the irreplaceable ecclesiastical treasures of 900 years of Byzantine civilization. The 4 bronze horses that, today, stand above the entrance of the Basilica of San Marco in Venice, were once the horses above the imperial hippodrome of Constantinople. The marble columns, the porphyry, the relics, the icons, much of what survives from medieval Byzantium today survives because it was looted to Venice in 1204. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, established in the city after the sack, would last for 57 years. It would never quite control more than a fraction of what the Byzantines had once held. It would govern badly, tax badly, lose territory steadily. The Greek population, which detested it, would refer to its rulers as Frankoi, Franks, foreigners. And in 1261, a Greek successor state, based in Nicaea, in northwestern Anatolia, would simply walk back into Constantinople, through gates left undefended on a quiet evening, and end the Latin episode without a serious fight. But the empire that returned to Constantinople in 1261 was a much smaller, poorer, more fragile thing than the empire that had fallen in 1204. The treasury was gone, the trade was in Italian hands, the army was small, the territories were a fraction of the 11th century empire. The next 200 years would not be a revival. They would be a long, slow, dignified slide toward the end. The Greek emperor who retook Constantinople in the late summer of 1261 was a soldier statesman named Michael VIII Palaiologos. He was the founder of the last and longest-lasting Byzantine dynasty, the Palaiologos dynasty, which would rule what was left of the empire from 1261 to the end, in 1453. For almost 200 years, every Byzantine emperor would be a Palaiologos. Michael VIII himself was a complicated man. He was an able general, a clever politician, an intelligent diplomat. He was also, deeply, the kind of man who would take desperate measures and lie about them afterward. He had, on his way to the throne, murdered the young legitimate heir of the Nicaean exile dynasty, a child named John IV, by blinding him in the Easter week of 1261. The Patriarch of Constantinople refused him communion for years afterward as a result. Michael, undeterred, pressed on with the work of restoring the empire. The empire he restored was a difficult thing to govern. The wealth of the Eastern Mediterranean was now firmly in Venetian and Genoese hands. The 2 Italian merchant republics had carved out, in the post-Crusade Aegean, a network of ports, privileges and commercial monopolies that the Byzantines could not, financially, dislodge. The Greek population resented Italian merchants, but Greek emperors, who needed Italian credit, generally pressured their patriarchs to tolerate them. Greek peasants, increasingly squeezed between Italian commerce and imperial taxation, began, slowly, to drift away from the imperial cause. The territories of the restored empire were, by any historical standard, a fragment. Most of the old Byzantine Aegean was now in the hands of various Latin lords, Italian trading colonies, or local Greek principalities that did not formally recognize Constantinople. Anatolia was almost entirely in Turkish hands. The Balkans were divided among Bulgarian, Serbian and Greek successor states. The empire that Michael ruled was, essentially, two corridors, a strip along the western coast of Anatolia, and a strip in southeastern Thrace and Macedonia, connected by the city of Constantinople. Perhaps a sixth of what Justinian had ruled, perhaps a tenth of what Basil II had ruled. The next 200 years are, in many ways, a story of slow loss. The Catalan Company, a band of Spanish mercenaries hired in the early 14th century to fight the Turks in Anatolia, instead turned on the Byzantines and devastated Thrace for years. The Ottoman Turks, who in the 14th century replaced the Seljuks as the dominant Turkish power in Anatolia, began slowly to cross into Europe through the Dardanelles, where they would, over the course of a century, conquer most of the Byzantine Balkans. By 1400, the Ottomans controlled most of what had been the European side of the empire. The Byzantines were left with the city itself, a few outposts in the southern Peloponnese, and not much else. The Palaiologos emperors throughout this period sent embassy after embassy westward, asking for help. They offered, repeatedly, to reunite the Greek and Latin churches under papal authority, in exchange for a crusade that would save Constantinople from the Ottomans. The reunion was negotiated several times at councils, most notably at the Council of Florence in 1439, where the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos and the Patriarch of Constantinople formally accepted Latin terms in exchange for Western military support. The reunion was rejected every time by the Byzantine population. The Greek monks of Athos and the parish priests of Constantinople refused to celebrate the Latin liturgy. The faithful refused to receive communion from clergy who had submitted. There is a famous saying from this period, attributed to a senior Byzantine official named Lucas Notaras: "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara." It is not clear that he actually said it. It is very clear that the sentiment was, by the mid-15th century, widespread. The crusade did not come. The help did not come. And in the spring of 1453, the city, by then almost entirely surrounded by Ottoman territory, was prepared alone to face a final siege. The siege began on the 6th of April, in the year 1453. The Ottoman Sultan was Mehmed II, 21 years old, brilliant, ambitious, ruthlessly determined to take what every Ottoman before him had failed to take. His army numbered, by most modern estimates, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 soldiers, supported by a great fleet, and most importantly, by an enormous new piece of artillery cast for him by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. Orban had, the previous year, offered his services to the Byzantine emperor first. The emperor had been unable to pay. Orban had then offered his services to Mehmed, who had paid him handsomely. The cannon Orban built for the Sultan was, by every account, the largest piece of artillery the world had yet seen. It was 27 feet long. It could fire a stone ball weighing 600 pounds. It could be reloaded only 3 times in a day. It could break, with patience, any wall in the Christian world. It could break the Theodosian walls. The defenders, inside Constantinople, numbered perhaps 7,000, of whom perhaps 2,000 were professional soldiers. The rest were militia, monks, foreign volunteers, and a small contingent of Genoese under a remarkable young captain named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. The emperor was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was about 48 years old. He had been emperor for nearly 4 years. He understood, as everyone in the city understood, that he was the last emperor of Rome. The siege lasted 53 days. The cannon, day after day, ground at the walls. Sections fell. The defenders, working through the night, repaired the breaches with timber, rubble, and whatever else they could pile. The Ottomans tried to mine under the walls. The defenders, advised by an old German engineer they had hired, countermined and killed the miners. The Ottomans launched by night, in a famous and almost unbelievable feat of engineering, a fleet of 70 small ships dragged overland on greased planks across the hilly peninsula of Galata. In order to bypass the great chain that closed the Golden Horn, the defenders saw them coming and held the harbor, just barely. But there were too few of them, the walls were too long, the cannon was too patient. On the night of the 28th of May, the eve of the final assault, the Emperor Constantine attended a final liturgy in the Hagia Sophia. The Greek and Latin clergy, who had been quarreling about the church reunion for centuries, served together. The choir sang. The candles burned. The senators of Constantinople, the soldiers of Genoa, the monks of the city, the women and the children, all came. The emperor took communion. He gave a short speech to the men of the army, asking them to die well if they had to die. Then, in the dark, he returned to the walls. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 29th of May, the final assault began. The Ottomans came in 3 waves. The first, of irregulars, was broken on the walls. The second, of better troops, was broken too. The third, of elite janissaries, found a small gate in the walls, the Kirche, that had been accidentally left unbarred during a sortie earlier in the night. They poured through. The walls, breached at last, were quickly overrun. The captain Justiniani was wounded in the chest and carried to the harbor, where he died on a Genoese ship, trying to flee back to the west. The defenders fell back into the city, fighting from street to street. The emperor, Constantine XI, stripped off his imperial purple, drew his sword and ran into the thickest part of the fighting. He was never seen alive again. His body was never identified. Some accounts say he was killed in the breach. Some say he was killed in the streets. Some say he simply disappeared. The legend, which is still told tonight in Greek-speaking villages, is that he was turned to marble by an angel, and lies, sleeping, somewhere beneath the city, waiting to return, when Constantinople is Greek again. The city fell. By midday the Ottoman troops had reached the Hagia Sophia. They turned it with great speed into a mosque. The Sultan rode in, on a white horse. He stood in the great central nave, looked up at the dome, the same dome Justinian had walked into, on a cold December morning, 916 years earlier, and is said to have wept. The Roman Empire had ended, after 1500 years. We have come to the end of our story. It has been a long walk. We began this evening in the cold of December, in the year 537, with an emperor crossing the threshold of a great new church. We have followed, since then, the slow and often humiliating journey of the empire that emperor inherited. The wars of Heraclius. The catastrophe of the Arab conquests. The walls that did not fall. The long internal argument over images. The Macedonian Renaissance. The disaster at Manzikert. The strange, awkward marriage with the Latin West. The sack of the city by men who claimed to be its allies. The slow restoration. The slow Ottoman noose. The final morning at the Kirche. It is, depending on how you count, either 916 years of story, or 1500. It is one of the longest survivals any human society has ever managed. And, like every empire we have ever followed in these long evenings, its real legacy is not the political fact of its existence, but the quieter inheritance it left to the world that came after it. The Greek Orthodox Church, which today still commemorates the city of Constantinople in every liturgy, every Sunday, in thousands of churches across the world. The Cyrillic alphabet, which the Byzantines designed for the Slavic peoples in the 9th century, and which is still used today by Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and many other languages. The body of Roman law that Justinian codified in the 6th century, which formed the foundation of European legal education in the medieval and early modern periods, and which still underlies the civil law systems of much of the world. The architectural form of the great domed church, which spread, after the Hagia Sophia, throughout the Christian East, and into the Islamic mosque tradition that built on it. The tradition of icon painting, which is, even tonight, one of the most beautiful religious art traditions humanity has ever produced. These things did not die with the city, they scattered. They were carried west, in Greek manuscripts brought to Italy in the years before and after 1453, and helped to ignite the Italian Renaissance. They were carried north, into Russia, where Moscow began, almost immediately, to think of itself as a third Rome after Constantinople's fall. They were carried south, into the Christian communities that survived under Ottoman rule for 400 years, and that emerged in the 19th century as the modern Orthodox nations of the Balkans and the Aegean. Even the city itself did not really die. It remained, under its new Ottoman rulers, the largest and most important city of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its Greek-speaking population continued to live there, increasingly diminished, but never quite extinguished, until well into the 20th century. Its Hagia Sophia, the great church Justinian had built in 537, the church Mehmed had wept beneath in 1453, would remain a mosque for nearly 500 years, then become a museum in 1934, then return to being a mosque in 2020. The dome holds. It always holds. We are at the end now. Take a moment, if you are still awake, to soften your shoulders, to unclench your jaw, to let the day, again, go. If you are not still awake, that perhaps is the better outcome. We did not promise you a history, we promised you a sleep. The history was simply the carriage in which the sleep arrived. In a moment, this will end. There will be silence. The music will fade. Then, in another moment, this will begin again, for the next listener, somewhere else, in another quiet evening. The history, like the empire, does not end. It only continues in some other room. We are very glad you came, we are very glad you stayed, we hope you sleep deeply and well. Good night from the Drowsy Historian.